Hey everyone, welcome to another card spotlight video. We are in the middle of Zendikar Rising spoilers, well technically the beginning, and we have some pretty cool cards being spoiled. I think some having modern playability, but I wanted to actually take a look at pathway lands. So these new cool type of lands that are being introduced in Zendikar Rising, and for the sake of explanation in this video, I'm going to be choosing blue and red, just kind of be on brand for Delver Brews. But everything I say here is going to obviously apply to all colors, all the different pathway combinations. So I mean, looking at River Glide Pathway and Lava Glide Pathway. First of all, the art, beautiful. I cannot wait to see these in foil. I really cannot wait. But let's take a look at them. So these are lands. They have no basic land type. And the normal side, the unflipped side, is going to be River Glide Pathway. And when you play this land, or / lands, you have the option of choosing which side you actually want played. So it's a one-time decision, and it's a permanent decision for that particular land drop. You either are going to be producing blue or you're going to be producing red, and that's it. It's one or the other. So a lot of interesting discussions I've seen on Twitter. I've been engaging with some people and just kind of thinking I've been doing in the background as well. And I wanted to do an analysis of the types of lands that we currently have available to us and how the pathway lands kind of fit in, if they fit in at all. Now my main slant here is going to be modern, and I guess anything that's eternal, any eternal format. I don't think in standard my arguments are going to apply as much, because standard is just a different world altogether. Your mana isn't perfect in standard as opposed to eternal formats like modern, legacy, vintage, commander, so on and so forth. So I'm going to be focusing on modern, and I think a lot of what I see here is going to apply to other formats as well. So let's take a look at our basics, our basic lands. At the end of the day, they produce 1 mana of whatever basic land type they are, and in this case island and mountain. So the island's always going to produce blue, mountain's always going to produce red. That's it. They're beautiful, they're basic, they do what they're supposed to do, and that's it. Now, do the pathway lands have an advantage over the basic lands in a vacuum? All right, so let's ignore the fact that there are fetches, for example. So let's just look at the basics in a vacuum. Now, if you just look at basics in a vacuum, the pathway lands are superior, right? Because they give you the flexibility. Would I want a deck that has a bunch of islands and mountains in it, or do I want a deck that has a bunch of River Glide Pathways or Lava Glide Pathways? Keep in mind we have a limit, right? These aren't basics, so we are limited to 4 per deck. But it's still a decision we want to make. Do we want to remove a bunch of basics and replace them with our pathways, or do we just keep our basics, right? So in a vacuum, obviously the pathways are better, right? They give us the option when we're playing them, and it reduces mulligan chances, because you are always you're more likely to have the type of mana that you need in opening hand. You don't have to rely on having the right basic, because the pathways allow you an option. Of course, this is more true in 2-color decks than in 3, 4, 5-color decks, but it kind of loosely applies to 3+ color decks as well. So in a vacuum, it's pretty good. I think the pathways are awesome. Again, you're limited to 4, so you can't play a million of these. But, most decks in Modern are not playing that many basics of one particular type. So, even in 2-color decks, they're not playing that many basics. So, you don't have many cards to swap here. But, I mean, let's move on, because looking at it in a vacuum is a mistake. There are other lands that you need to take into consideration. So, let's look at shock lands and pain lands. So obviously the pain lands are the weaker of the dual color lands, because you're pinging yourself for 1 damage each time you tap it for color. But I think it's still valid here. It still sees play in eternal formats. In this case, Shivan Reef, and in this case, is Shivan Reef going to be better than the pathway lands? In my opinion, yes. If you are looking for the most consistent mana base possible, Shivan Reef or the Pain lands in general are going to override your pathway lands. Now, do you have to make a decision between the two? Not necessarily. But as you expand your land options, all of a sudden the pathway lands start to become more clunky, especially as you get into 3 and 4 colors. Let's just say 3 because I think 3 is probably an average. You know, when you're in 3 color decks, now the pathway lands are getting a bit more clunky, and once we get the fetches, you're going to see how pathway lands are really not as good as they may seem. So you have your Shivan Reef, and of course you have Steam Vents or your any of your shock lands, and those are, in my opinion, your best mana fixers in most formats. In the sense, if you're talking about just lands, because again, they come down, they can come in tapped, or they can come in untapped, and you pay 2 life just once. They're fetchable. They have both basic land types in them, so they count for other spells or other lands that require certain land types to be in play, and they just, you know, they check essentially all the boxes here. The only thing that would be better in a shock land is that you don't have to pay 2 life and they come into battlefield untapped. But you know, those cards do exist, and they're like $700-800 each. So let's not go there. But if we're talking about mostly affordable Magic, shock lands are the best you're going to get in terms of consistent mana fixing. So again, here, if you're weighing your land options in most decks, are you going to remove a shock land to make way for a pathway? I don't think you are. I think in a budget deck you will be, and I think, and you know, one of the points I want to make here is I think pathway lands are going to be awesome drop-ins for budget decks where they don't want to necessarily play expensive cards like Steam Vents or any of the shock lands. So pathway lands actually in budget decks, these are amazing news for budget decks. So again, as you expand your card, as you expand your land options, pathway lands become less and less desirable. So let's move on to check lands, or at least the cards I consider check lands. You have Spire Bluff Canal, which requires 2 or fewer other lands in play to come into battlefield untapped, or else it comes into battlefield tapped. Fine, but then it produces, you know, 2 colors of, you know, 1 color of your choosing between 2, and that's it. It's unconditional after it comes into play. Sulphur Falls is looking for a basic land type, either island or mountain. Of course, replace Sulphur Falls with any of the other lands in this cycle, and you have the same effect. Now, keep in mind, so if you're playing Sulphur Falls, do you want to play a basic or do you want to play a pathway? Answer is obvious here. You definitely want to play the basics, or else Sulphur Falls is almost always going to be coming to battlefield tapped. And again, now you are seeing how not having that basic land type in the pathway cards actually makes really, really big difference. You know, not even including like Mystic Sanctuary or any creatures that require forests to be in play, or whatever it is that requires a specific basic land type. These are not going to satisfy those cards. So again, it's really gonna come down to a juggling match in your mana base, and a lot of decks are not going to have that room. So it's something you're going to have to play with, and honestly, I'm going to have to play with. I might completely revise my opinion of this as the weeks go on and as we actually get games in with them. But I really think that, again, as you expand your land options, so as you go back into more, you know, bigger Eternal formats, pathway lands are cool, but not the best options out there. And of course, the land type or that makes pathway lands really lose their value, or at least show their lack of value, are the fetches. So in Modern, in Legacy, in Vintage, and many formats that are not in Standard, you have access to fetches. And fetches really make a big difference here in terms of your decision on pathway lands. When I'm running fetches, it's because I want to go get the lands that I need at any given time to be able to fix my mana. With basics, I can do that. With shocks, I can do that. With any other card type, I really can't. So that includes, you know, the cards I've already covered in this video: Sulphur Falls, Spire Bluff Canal, Shivan Reef. Those are, and of course the pathway lands. I can't go and fetch those cards, which is why in most decks you're playing a limited number of them, and your shocks are often going to outnumber them in some number, or at least be on an equal pairing, right? At the end of the day, your fetches are going to be targeting your basics or your shocks. If you are removing any number of basics, I don't think you'd be removing any number of shocks. But if you're going to be removing any number of basics to make way for pathway lands, you're reducing the fetch targets for your fetches, and that's a problem again. So what are you really gaining by playing the pathway lands? for me, the only real benefit in eternal formats is, this is not even my idea. This is something I missed. This is someone on Twitter that brought up to me, is that you are most likely reducing the amount of times you need to mulligan because you don't have the right lands in your opening hand. And that is true. Again, mostly for 2-color decks, but it's also probably true for 3-color decks. Oftentimes I have to mulligan because I needed a forest and instead I had an island, and I can't play my turn 1 Arbor Elf or something, right? That's a problem. If I had whatever pathway has blue and green, then I don't really have an issue because I choose, on the turn 1 when I'm doing my land drop which side I want to play. Problem solved. So when it comes to the early game, making your early land drops and maybe fixing your lands early on, and by early on I really mean turn 1 and 2, because after that you should be fetching and you should be drawing into other land types anyway. So, but in the early game, turn 0, turn 1, sure, pathway lands are actually a bit better than your basics. But again, if you're looking at it within that context, a lot of cards look really good. If you're only looking at it in terms of making your opening hands better, but then once you actually get into the game, they become a bit more clunky. So, again, this is really my raw thinking on the subject. I wanted to kind of just go out there and tell you what I think about these pathway lands. They are really, really awesome. They may have some place in the mana base, but you are definitely not replacing your basics with them. Almost certainly not. And you are not, going to be replacing any of your dual color producing lands with them either. Maybe you'll be replacing your check lands if that's what you're really looking for, but I would think that would be a mistake. You're definitely not going to be replacing your shocks unless you're going budget. And again, if you're running fetches, you're going to want to have proper fetch targets. So in this case, shock lands and basics. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but considering these are not basic land types, if I Blood Moon you, you're going to lose access to blue, in this case, in the case of River Glide Pathway. That's a problem, okay? Especially if you're reducing the amount of basics to play these cards. So let's just assume you don't reduce the amount of basics, you reduce other lands in your deck. What are you going to be reducing? What are you going to remove? Let's look at the cards here that you have on my screen. Am I going to be replacing Steam Vents? No. Am I replacing Shivan Reef? I don't think so. Probably because I also need Shivan Reef's, colorless land production, or colorless mana production. So I'm probably not replacing Shivan Reef. Am I going to replace Sulphur Falls and Spirebluff Canal? I don't know. Those cards produce blue or red, whereas opposed to the Pathway lands, which are only going to produce one of them, right? So what am I really going to be replacing? So again, expand this into the hundreds of decks that exist in the Eternal formats, and you probably will find a few instances where Pathway lands are pretty cool. That being said, I don't know if they're really going to fit into the Eternal formats. I think in Standard they're going to be pretty fun, especially since Standard doesn't have any fetches. So, if fetches were in Standard, I would also say that Pathway lands seem less optimal because you want actual targets for your fetches, and these wouldn't be targets. So that's what I want to say. I could probably ramble on for 10 more minutes, but I think that would be a waste. What do you think? Have I missed something really critical? I probably have. I've only had a few days to really mull this over, but if you think I missed something critical in an Eternal format where you think Pathway lands are actually going to shine, please let me know. I would love to have that discussion with you in the comment section down below, or on Twitter, or wherever it is. I would love that. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you enjoy my content in general, please subscribe, hit that notification bell, follow me on Twitter, help me out by becoming a patron. Whatever it is that you can do, it really, really helps me out. Everything is encouraging. I love all of the comments that I'm getting from all of you. Super, super constructive. Thanks, and have a good one.